Hello there and welcome to the Card Grotto. Today I'm decorating die cut balloons using stencils. So let's get started. This is the Hero Arts Balloon Bunch Fancy Dies. This is a really fun set. You've got the bouquet of balloons. There's also an individual balloon and the string for that, and also a bow. Now technically this balloon doesn't coordinate with the balloons in the bouquet, but I'm going to do a little bit of a hack so that it does, and that means that I can colour in these balloons a little bit easier. So I have cut the bouquet of the balloons and then also that individual balloon 4 times from Deluxe Smooth White cardstock. I'm then going to add some ink blending on top. So I've got the individual balloons to start with. I'm adding some temporary adhesive onto this one here, popping that down onto some scrap paper so that I can add some ink blending on top. I'm using Hero Arts core inks today in some rainbow shades. So I'm starting off with a Dandelion. And I've got a medium sized ink blending brush here, and I want to focus most of the darker colour around the outside edges of the balloon and have it lighter in the centre. Now ordinarily with this I would bring in a few different shades of the same colour of ink, so I would use a darker shade of yellow around the outside edges and then a lighter one in the centre. But because I'm already using 7 different shades of ink today, I didn't want to bring in tons of them, so I thought I would just do it with the one shade of ink, and I think it worked out quite nicely. So I went around the outside edges to start with, and then when I felt that there wasn't enough kind of ink on the brush and that I would need to reload it, I just went over the inside, so it became a lot lighter than the outside edges. I then went back around the outside edges with more ink to darken them up, and I do think it works quite nicely even with the one shade of ink. I could have cut these from some colour cardstock and then used ink around the outside edges, and that would work quite nicely as well because I would just need the one shade of ink. But because I'm adding some of these onto the base layer of the bouquet, I did want them to be the white cardstock. So for that pink balloon I used Ultra Pink, and now for the purple one I'm using Amethyst, which is one of my favourite shades of purple ink. This is quite dry at this point, I do need to re-ink it. So this one is taking me a little while to kind of get that saturation of ink, but again I'm just going around the outside edges. This just adds some dimension onto the balloons and make them look a little bit more rounded. For the blue balloon I'm using Aquatic, and this ink in comparison is really very juicy, so this one ended up being quite a lot darker than the others, but I do really like how it turned out. So again, just going around the outside edges, and I do tap off the excess ink from the brush. I do think I get a smoother blend that way. And I also like using the smaller brushes for the smaller die cuts. I've then got my bouquet here, and to start with I want to mask off the strings of the balloons. I want to keep them white and just have the colour of the balloons on the actual balloon itself. So I'm grabbing some post-it tape here, masking those off, and then I can add ink onto this balloon here on the right hand side, and I'm using Papaya ink for that. Now technically this balloon should be in front of the one at the bottom. You can see that string there, but I don't want to have to worry about masking off that string to keep that white. So I'm just going to have it so that the balloon that is below it is going to be in front of the one that's above it, if that makes sense. And I think once I add it on top, you would never know that it was meant to be in that orientation. And it was just a little bit easier for me to not have to mask off that area. I'm then going to bring in my stencil here so that I can add the pattern on top. Since I've got all of that masking in place, it made sense for me to do this now. This is the Hero Arts Sparkle Weave Stencil, and I really love the pattern on it. It's kind of like diamonds but with curved edges. I want to make sure that I'm adding the diamonds in the same kind of orientation as where the balloon is facing. So all of these balloons are facing in a slightly different way. So I do want to make sure that I try and keep the pattern the same basically, so it looks straight on the balloons. So I've popped that in place, and now I can add ink blending on top with the same ink. Again, I'm focusing the darker colour towards the outside edges and then fading to a bit lighter in the centre. And then once I lift this stencil off, you can see the beautiful pattern that it adds onto the balloon. Just adds a bit more interest onto the flat die cuts. I thought about maybe adding the pattern, like it be a different pattern on each of the balloons. I do think that would be quite fun, but for today I thought I would use the same stencil for all of them. So I've got a scrap piece of paper here to mask off the other side of this bouquet so that I can add some colour onto the top balloon here on the left hand side. And for this one I'm using Bermuda ink. Again, this is one of my favourites. I really love this teal shade. And I'm not too worried about the balloons that's next to the ones that I'm adding the ink blending on, because they're going to get covered up. So again, I can bring in the stencil, and although I'm having it so that the pattern is all the same on each of the balloons, because I'm using a slightly different area of the stencil, sometimes the kind of diamond is in the center of the balloon and sometimes it's kind of off to the side, which is quite nice. So they all do look a little bit different. And then for the balloon here at the top, I'm using Aegean ink, and this is kind of like a green toned turquoise. I'm not always a huge fan of having grass green kind of colour in a rainbow, so I thought it would be quite nice to have more of this sort of turquoisey colour. Again, I can place the stencil on top and then add that ink blending on top of that. And I didn't need to clean that stencil too many times because the areas are so small. But in this instance, when I go onto the individual balloons, I did clean it in between. So now I've got enough space to kind of move that stencil around for all of these individual balloons. So I can do the same thing here with this blue balloon. And then I can move on to all of the other balloons, and then I can finish off with this pink one here. And I just think they look really pretty with that pattern. I can now assemble these balloons. Because that string was supposed to have kind of like this curly bit at the bottom, since I'm covering that up, I did just want to cut that off. And then because these balloons, although they are the same size and technically the same shape, the little bit at the bottom isn't quite the same kind of shape, so I do just want to cut those off. It was pretty easy to do. I just kind of cut off each side of the string with my scissors, and it doesn't have to be too neat because the balloon is going to kind of cover it over the bottom of the balloon that I add on top, so it didn't need to be too neat, which was quite good. I'm then adding some precision glue onto the back of this balloon here, and then I can pop that in place, and that's going to cover up all of that horrible ink blending underneath, which looked a bit messy. And the good thing about using liquid glue is that I can kind of move that in place. I've got that wiggle time to try and line it up as best as possible. I can then bring in the pink one here, add that glue on the back, and then pop that in place. And you can see now that it doesn't really matter, I don't think, which way these balloons kind of go once I've covered up that string. I've then got the blue one here. I could do the same thing, add the glue onto the back of that and pop that in place. And then I can just finish off with the purple one. And for some reason, this one does seem to line up quite nicely with the base layer. So I didn't cut that one down. Again, I'm just taking my time to wiggle that in place, and then I can set that aside to dry. I can now work on my card base. So this is an A2 size card base, so a finished size of 4¼ inches by 5½ inches, and I've made that from some pitch black cardstock. I thought it'd be quite nice to add some scoring detail onto the front of this card base. Because my design is really quite clean and simple, it's quite nice just to have something in the background, but nothing that detracts your kind of eye away from the focal point. So I quite like adding scoring lines to cards. So I've got my scoreboard here and my stylus, and I'm just running my stylus every ½ inch across the card base. So I can just finish off with this line here at the bottom. And then once I turn it over, you can see how really lovely that is, and it just adds that little bit of extra detail onto the card. I'm adding some thin foam tape onto the back of the balloons. I really love using thin foam tape because I can add a couple of layers onto it without the card being too bulky, but in this instance it's really helpful as well because I don't want to add foam tape onto the back of the strings, and so I don't want it to be two-dimensional. I am adding this tiny little bit here at the bottom, but I thought that it wasn't too high up enough that it was kind of going to get crushed in the mail or anything like that. I could have die cut the bouquet multiple times and sort of layered them up on top of each other, but sometimes I don't always love that look. Sometimes I do just prefer the look of foam tape, so that's what I did today. I stamped and heat embossed a sentiment from the Hero Arts Folk Art stamp set, cut that into a strip and added that onto the card with some more thin foam tape. I then thought it'd be quite nice to add a little bit of extra embellishment onto the card, so I'm taking the Hero Arts flower pattern cover plate. I'm going to die cut that from some more deluxe smooth white cardstock. So I've run that through my die cutting machine, and now I've got all of these lovely flowers and butterflies. I'm just using 3 of the butterflies today, but I am going to keep this panel so that I can use it on future cards. I thought it'd be quite cute to have some butterflies kind of flying in the air and then have them sort of land on the balloons. So I'm just manipulating those wings a little bit, folding them upwards so it looks like they're kind of in flight or that they've just landed on the balloons. So I can add some liquid glue onto the back of the butterflies, and for some reason at that point one of the butterflies decided to fly away. I'm not quite sure actually what happened there, but it was just on my desk, so I found it quite easily. As I'm adhering these down onto the card, I'm just lifting up those wings again. That's just going to add a little bit extra dimension onto the card. And then to finish off, I wanted a little bit of extra embellishment just around the outside of the balloons. So I'm bringing in some Hero Hues enamel dots. This is the neutrals pack, and I'm just using the black ones here. So they're not going to be kind of too in your face, but it is just going to add some extra visual interest onto the card. So I'm just adding a few around the outside edges of these balloons here. I do tend to like adding embellishments in odd numbers, so I'm kind of just seeing as I go here how many I'm adding. And then at this point I do think I add them all up just to see. I have got an odd number, and I thought it'd be quite nice to add some of them into the centres of the butterflies as well, just to kind of finish them off as well. And so that's the card finished for today. I really love how those bright colours pop against that black background, and you can see there with those scoring lines, I do think it does make a big difference to a clean and simple card. Links to the products that I used will be listed in the description bar on YouTube and also over on my blog. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.